From China, Buddhism traveled to Japan. Japan is a group of mountainous islands off the coast of China. Because Japan did not develop writing until the 5th century, the early history of Japan is generally mysterious. We do know that early Japanese writing, arts, crafts, laws, and government were somewhat based on Chinese methods. Japanese culture and lifestyle is very much affected by the geography of the country. Because there is little land suited for agriculture, the sea became very important as a provider of food. The countryside is very beautiful, and this has inspired reverence for nature in Japanese arts and poets through the centuries. Unlike the emperors of China, the emperors of Japan received great honor but had very little power. In the 1500s, Japan was ruled by a military official called a shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled Japan for 250 years. During this era, feudalism existed in Japan in much of the same way as it operated in medieval Europe. Landowner warriors were called samurai, and the most powerful of them were daimyo, or lords. Samurai pledged loyalty to their daimyo and gave military support as well. Rice farmers farmed the lands of the daimyo and received protection from the lords. Some historical background. Centuries ago, a feudal system was established in Japan. As a form of payment for loyalty and military protection, Japanese nobility bestowed samurai warriors with property or monetary compensation. However, the most influential warriors were the only ones to receive land. Their lands were cultivated by peasants who provided the samurai with money or crops on an annual basis. The majority of samurai were merely compensated with food, normally rice. The major focus of the samurai was that of a combatant. Samurai wore intricate armor, knew how to utilize several weapons, and fought mainly on horseback. As time elapsed, the reputation of samurai rose to a status of honor in Japanese society. When they marched through villages and cities, the crowds divided to allow them passage. Out of respect and fear, the public would drop their gaze to the ground because a samurai had legal justification to kill anyone who displayed insolence. The Japanese term samurai means those who serve. Each samurai had to pay homage to their noble without hesitation, even if it caused the samurai personal suffering. If a samurai were to fail their lord, they were required to perform seppuku, a ritual suicide, rather than bear the disgrace. While Portuguese explorers and traders did visit Japan in the mid 1500s, the country was relatively isolated because of its geographical barriers. Both the strong sea currents and the mountains made it difficult for outsiders to invade easily. Even today, it is not unusual for a person to live his whole life on one island without ever visiting the others. Like the Chinese, the Japanese saw foreigners as barbarians, but they saw them as being more amusing than threatening and did not attempt to keep them out. Also, Japanese society of that time was based on warriors. They saw that European weapons could bring them power, so they bought cannon and muskets from Portuguese merchants. Before long, Japanese craftsmen learned how to make guns, and the daimyo provided them to their troops. The merchants were soon followed by Jesuit missionaries who adopted Japanese customs to increase the possibility of converting people to Catholicism. The missionaries were amazed at the Japanese habit of daily bathing, as Europeans of that time rarely washed. They tried to change their manners so as not to offend the Japanese. One priest wrote, "They are much amazed at our eating with the hands and wiping them on napkins, which then remain covered with food stains, and this causes them disgust." Jesuit priests even established formal tea rooms in their own homes to receive their visitors properly. The most notable missionary was Francis Xavier, who later became a Catholic saint. He lived there only 2 years, but made hundreds of converts. Christianity spread quickly, especially when some of the daimyos became supportive. Christian symbols were fashionable, and even non Christian Japanese wore rosaries and crucifixes, as they believed these items would bring good luck and success. Catholic missionaries traveled freely throughout Japan for about 90 years. Japan's seclusion. By 1600, over 300,000 Japanese had converted to Christianity. The Tokugawa shoguns began to grow suspicious of the Christians because their influence became so powerful. They were afraid Japanese Christians might revolt against the shogunate. Japanese officials began to persecute Christians and killed many of them, common people and priests alike. When the Christians refused to cooperate, the government did its best to wipe them out completely. They also enacted a law called the Act of Seclusion, instituting a ban on all Europeans except the Dutch. The Dutch were allowed to remain because they never tried to spread their religious beliefs. Even so, they traveled to Japan on a very limited basis. Only 2 ships a year were permitted. They were also limited to the port of Nagasaki, where they could engage in trade. Dutch travelers were required to stay on a small island in Nagasaki Bay and were not allowed to cross the bridge to the mainland. In addition to barring Europeans, the Act of Seclusion said all Japanese residing abroad shall be put to death when they return home. At the same time, the government made it illegal to build any ships large enough for ocean voyages, making it impossible for citizens to leave. Clearly, Japan was serious about cutting itself off from the Western world. For 200 years, the policy of seclusion meant they had very little news went in to or out of Japan, other than what the Dutch traders brought. The isolationist policy also meant Japan fell behind Europe in science, technology, and military power. On the other hand, it gave Japan a long period of peace and stability. Much growth and change occurred during those 2 centuries. A new style of theater called kabuki developed. It mixed some older traditions with very stylized acting, dancing, music, and elaborate costumes. A new form of poetry became popular during that time, especially among city people. It is still in existence. Called haiku, it has only 17 syllables in 3 lines and is supposed to express thought to surprise the reader, using a striking image, often from nature, that suggests a deeper meaning. Zen Buddhism also developed during Japan's period of isolation. The Japanese period of isolation came to an end in 1854 when President Milford Fillmore of the United States sent Commodore Matthew Perry to negotiate a trade agreement with Japan. Within a few years, Japan had trade agreements with Great Britain, Russia, France, and the Netherlands as well. Today, Japan is a leader in trade and commerce around the globe. And that's the end of the supplemental reading of Japan. And don't forget the reading guide, fill in the blanks, and use the headings to kind of help you figure out where you are at within the reading.